This new economic age is not the result of a hodgepodge of independent institutional revolutions occurring in schools and governments and corporations. Rather, it's a result of a single thought revolution. Your thinking is not something that goes on separate from reality. Your thinking defines your reality. We are in the midst of an economic transformation more sweeping than any since the Renaissance brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. But what we are now experiencing is perhaps most clearly paralleled by the Industrial Revolution that began more than 200 years ago. Industrial capital was not created when people changed the products they made. Capital was created once people began to change the methods of making those products. Similarly, intellectual capital is not created by changing what we think about. Capital is created by changing our methods of thinking. Until we begin to invest time into continually changing and improving our methods of thinking, we will be dealing with intellectual tools rather than intellectual capital. For the last 100 years, the productivity of people who make and move things, the folks who use industrial capital, has continually increased. The productivity of knowledge workers, the folks who use intellectual tools, has not kept pace. To change this will require that we focus upon natural, yet seemingly unfamiliar ways of learning. Since about the Second World War, a growing number of scientists and philosophers have been articulating theories about systems.
We can understand the world as things, that is parts or components, and their relations, that is how they are connected or fit together. So take a car for example. It is made up of parts, car parts such as engine, wheels and so on, and these parts are put together or organized in a specific way so as to make them function as a vehicle of transport. Now we call a group of things that are not organized in this way a set. So we'd call a group of cups on a table a set of cups because unlike the parts to our car, they have not been designed to serve some collective function. Because the group of cups is simply the sum of its parts, we would describe them by describing the individual properties of each cup, and this would tell us everything we need to know about them. This approach to describing things is called analysis or reductionism. Reductionism is the traditional approach taken within modern science that tries to describe complex phenomena in terms of their individual parts. Now take the human body that is highly organized through a complex set of relations between its parts. Out of the arrangement of these parts in a specific way, we get the overall functioning of the living organism. Because the parts are so strongly defined by their connections and function within the body as an entirety, to properly describe the parts, we need to first understand the functioning of the whole body. This approach to describing things, that is, that we can best describe things by understanding their place within the functioning of the whole they are a part of, is called synthesis, and synthesis is the foundations of systems thinking. Thus we have two different approaches to describing things. On the one hand, analysis that is interested in describing the individual components, and synthesis that talks about the relationship between these components and their functioning as a whole.
Observing similar principles across all systems, whether those systems were biological or chemical, microscopic or as large as a planet. They found that at higher levels of organization, new realities emerge. And these realities are lost on the reductionist thinker. You can know all about animal cells, but fail to explain the difference between a monkey and a sloth. One lesson learned from systems thinking is that the environment determines what is true. If I were to plant a lemon seed here in Southern California, I'd get a tree like this one, and I would get fruit. If I were to plant it 1,000 miles further north, I might get a tree, but I certainly wouldn't get any fruit. And if I were to plant it 1,000 miles even further north, I wouldn't even get a tree. The exact same instructions are in the seeds in this fruit, but it is not true that this seed will become a tree. That result depends upon the environment. Reductionist thinking, by reducing its focus inwards to smaller pieces, largely ignores the environment. It's not surprising that a culture adopting reductionist thinking would eventually confront environmental crises. A sensitivity to the environment is not limited to an appreciation for nature. Environmental awareness means concern for consequences that spill across easily defined boundaries. I would argue that a firm that's insensitive about what it's doing to the natural environment is probably insensitive to the importance of the work environment that often determines levels of creativity, honesty, and enjoyment. It will fail to respond to radical changes in its market environment. A concern with nature is just one aspect of environmental awareness. One obvious reason for people to appreciate systems is that modern organizations are systems. But there's an even more important reason to learn about them. Perhaps the most powerful system is a system created by the interaction of the world and our perception of it. As we begin to change this system, we begin to profoundly alter what is possible.
I suppose, accordingly, that all the things which I see are false, fictitious. I believe that none of those objects which my fallacious memory represents ever existed. I suppose that I possess no senses. I believe that body, figure, extension, motion, and place are merely fictions of my mind. What is there, then, that can be esteemed true? Perhaps this only, that there is absolutely nothing certain. But how do I know that there is not something different altogether from the objects I have now enumerated, of which it is impossible to entertain the slightest doubt? Is there not a God, or some being, by whatever name I may designate him, who causes these thoughts to arise in my mind? But why suppose such a being? For it may be I myself am capable of producing them. Am I, then, at least not something? But I before denied that I possessed senses or a body. I hesitate, however, for what follows from that? Am I so dependent on the body and the senses that without these I cannot exist? But I had the persuasion that there was absolutely nothing in the world, that there was no sky and no earth, neither minds nor bodies. Was I not, therefore, at the same time persuaded that I did not exist? Far from it. I assuredly existed, since I was persuaded. But there is I know not what being who is possessed at once of the highest power and the deepest cunning, who is constantly employing all his ingenuity in deceiving me. Doubtless, then, I exist, since I am deceived, and let him deceive me as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall be conscious that I am something. So that it must, in fine, be maintained, all things being maturely and carefully considered, that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time it is expressed by me, or conceived in my mind.
In training and education, we have an example of fragmentation. In keeping with the reductionist approach, we separated learning from work, split it out separately into training rooms and schools. And these classrooms are led by an instructor who knows more about the subject than the students. Information or knowledge is not created through this process. It is merely distributed from teacher to student, and often no further. Knowledge comes from experience. Everything else is information. Too narrowly defined learning. We've placed a great deal of emphasis on training and development, but almost no emphasis on experience and discovery. An alarming percentage of information shared in classes never makes it any farther than students' notepads. Discovery is another way to learn. Rather than just a process by which information is dispersed, Experience and discovery is a process in which new knowledge can be generated and information actually created. It is not obvious that we can accomplish the most important learning through lectures. Parents learn that some things they just can't tell their teenagers. Some things have to be learned through experience. Of course, you can't tell parents that. They too have to learn through experience. Piaget, who studied child psychology and development, distinguished between assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is a matter of putting new data into old categories. For example, if a small child believes that all animals are dogs, seeing a new dog just confirms his existing categories. Any new dog he encounters becomes new data that gets filed into his old category that is labeled dog. This kind of learning is assimilation. Now, if that child then sees a horse, his immediate response is to say, big dog. He first tries to change the data to fit his existing category, dogs. A better strategy, however, is to change his mental categories. This new data requires a new category, horses. Even more, it requires that he modify an old category, animals. He learns that dogs are not the only kind of animal. So learning involves adding a horse category and changing the animal category. This kind of learning is accommodation and is more powerful than simply assimilating new data. The idea that for a new object we might have to create a new concept, perhaps a new method of thinking, is deeply repugnant to us. The history of philosophy is there, however, and shows us the eternal conflict of systems, the impossibility of satisfactorily getting the real into the ready-made garments of our ready-made concepts. But in terms of learning, it is far more powerful to make revisions to our categories of thought and methods of thinking. Intel CEO Andrew Groves says that business is an experiment. Deming popularized the plan, do, study, act cycle, one powerful way to create business experiments. First, plan an event. Don't debate a great deal, but do clearly state your assumptions. Then just do it. End the discussion and learn how well your theory accords with reality. Study your results and then act on them. Was your theory confirmed? What was unexpected? How could you repeat the plan in order to create more knowledge? How could you use this new knowledge to improve? So let's practice the plan, do, study, act cycle on a real problem. I've borrowed this problem from statisticians because it has lessons that apply to organizations. It will give you the opportunity to test a theory. And it teaches us that the first step in systems optimization is realizing that we are dealing with a system. Systems optimization, by the way, is doing what is best for the whole system rather than just the parts. Here's a setup. Suppose that you are on a game show and you are given the choice of 3 doors. Behind one door is a contract for your dream job. Behind the others, unemployment checks. You pick a door, say number 1, and the host, who knows what's behind the other doors, opens another door, say number 3, which has an unemployment check. He then says to you, do you want to pick door number 2? Do you want to switch? Is it to your advantage to switch? Well, let's find out. Let's test one of 3 rules. Only one of these rules or theories can be true. We'll design an experiment to discover which one. The first rule is that it makes no difference whether or not you switch. You may as well flip a coin. The second rule is that it is better to stay. The third rule is that it is better to switch. If you repeat the experiment 20 times and you are not dealing with bent cards or psychics, your results will look something like this. If you flipped a coin, you won about 50% of the time, say 9 to 11 times out of the 20. Now, if you stayed, you won about 1/3 of the time, only 6 to 8 times. And if you switched, you won about 2/3 of the time, say 12 to 14 times. Now, before I explain why this is called a paradox rather than apparent, let me describe the method typically used to solve this problem. This method is called the reductionist approach. Do you remember Descartes' fifth rule? Reduce obscure and complex propositions step by step to those that are simpler. This problem has complexity. You are faced with three doors, one open, one chosen, and one more closed. Without questioning it, most people adopt Descartes' method of reductionism. The contestant knows that the open door does not contain the dream job. So faced with the complexity of three doors, the contestant's first step is to reduce this complexity to something simpler. But excluding the third door leaves the contestant with a fairly simple problem. Choose between two doors. But to exclude the third door is to incorrectly state the problem. The correct way to state the Monty Hall problem is not to question the probability of winning if one switches between two doors. Rather, you should question how the open door is related to the one you haven't chosen. If you must do this exercise alone, you have to wear the hat of both contestant and game show host. First, as a contestant, you choose one card. Now, to decide which of the other two you open, you must look at them both. To open the door, you wear your game show host hat. Now, here's the key. If the dream job card is either of these two unchosen cards, you win by switching. You never throw away a dream job card. You just throw away the no job cards. That is, if you switch, you double your odds of winning. Now, the difficult part of this problem comes from incorrectly excluding the third door, because once you've done that, winning is a flip of the coin. But to exclude the third door is the wrong way to state the problem. Someone once found Einstein deep in thought and remarked that he must be struggling to solve a very difficult problem. No, he responded, I'm not trying to solve the problem. I'm struggling to state it, because once I've properly stated it, the answer should follow. The way that we state a problem immediately constrains the answers. People are generally capable of solving problems. What receives far less attention is stating problems. Too often we enthusiastically begin to solve problems without ever asking whether the problems are correctly stated. Life differs from school in that in life we have to both state the answer and the question. My experience has been that few people understand this explanation without actually having done the experiment. And once you've done the experiment, you hardly need the explanation. Solving the Monty Hall paradox requires that you shift your method of thinking. New methods of thinking fall under the heading of accommodation, something greatly facilitated by experience. And this little exercise contains within it a number of lessons. You learn the best method by collecting enough data to calculate probabilities, not just by watching a single round. Also, many of you learned a better method by challenging the method you knew to be right. And you learned to look for relationships. Relationships are terribly critical to systems thinking. Systems are defined by their interaction, not their parts. Let me put that another way. The defining characteristic of a system emerges from the interaction of the parts. Speech, for instance, is not the product of a voice box or lungs or tongue or brain. Rather, speech is a result of the interaction between those parts. Interactions become terribly important to understanding. If you understand everything about a part, except the system it is a part of, you actually know very little. For instance, what would you think if I told you that I knew all about spark plugs, but knew nothing about engines? Now, this is not to say that reductionist thinking is bad. Parents know how marvelous it is when a child does finally learn to limit his focus. There is a place for focusing on elements rather than interactions. What is bad is being unaware that there is an option. What is bad is believing that reductionist thinking is synonymous with thinking rather than a subset of thinking. Gaining awareness of how we think is the first step in creating intellectual capital. As we learn more about the interactions of systems, we are better able to predict and influence systems' behavior. The same is not necessarily true if we focus on learning more about the elements. Success didn't come from knowing that choosing between two closed doors was a 50-50 proposition. Success came from knowing how those two doors were related to the third, already open door. The brain is a lesson in the power of interactions. Learning is, literally, the result of growing interdependencies. Shortly after your birth, the number of brain cells you had was fixed. You don't get more brain cells as you learn more. If you did, people could tell how much you had learned just by looking at the size of your head. What does happen is this. The connections between the brain cells grow. As you learn more, these connections, called dendrites, lengthen to connect a greater number of brain cells. One learns by changing and increasing the interaction of brain cells, not by changing the brain cells themselves. Similarly, organizations learn by improving the interaction of their elements, not by improving the elements in isolation. And the most critical interaction of any system is its interaction with its environment. It is upon the environment that any system, natural or social, depends for its survival. The biological model was for centuries the way to learn about nature. If you wanted to learn about an animal, you simply took it out of its environment to a place in which you could more closely scrutinize it. This has only changed in the last century. The ecological model, by contrast, involves understanding the animal in its environment. This leads to a much richer understanding, requiring that we learn about the ecosystem of which the animal is part. David Bohm, a philosopher who explored the implications of new scientific understanding, argued that we will never correct the fragmentation in our society until we've corrected the fragmentation in our thinking. To illustrate this point, he used the delightful example of a state wave. What Bohm calls a state wave, you and I would probably call a ripple. It is a wave in a stream that remains fixed as water courses through it. He commented that it would be foolish to try to understand a state wave by focusing on it to the exclusion of the stream around it. No one ever became successful by focusing on the state wave. Success follows from focusing on the stream. The systems thinking perspective can transcend the narrow boundaries of an organization. Perhaps what will be most rewarding as we adopt a systems perspective is the possibility of reversing fragmentation in the one area most important to all of us, our lives. Longtime systems thinking advocate Russell Ackoff says that during the Renaissance, people first applied the reductionist approach to life. Work, play, and learning were the major elements of life around which society began to create separate arenas. We could begin to reverse this fragmentation. The possibility of reuniting work, play, and learning into fuller and more satisfying lives is perhaps the most delightful of the possibilities offered by this change in thinking.
So take a car, for example. It is made up of parts, car parts such as engine, wheels, and so on, and these parts are put together or organized in a specific way so as to make them function as a vehicle of transport. Now we call a group of things that are not organized in this way a set. So we'd call a group of cups on a table a set of cups because unlike the parts to our car, they have not been designed to serve some collective function. Because the group of cups is simply the sum of its parts, we would describe.
This new economic age is not the result of a hodgepodge of independent institutional revolutions occurring in schools and governments and corporations. Rather, it's a result of a single thought revolution. Your thinking is not something that goes on separate from reality. Your thinking defines your reality. We are in the midst of an economic transformation more sweeping than any since the Renaissance brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. But what we are now experiencing is perhaps most clearly paralleled by the Industrial Revolution that began more than 200 years ago. Industrial capital was not created when people changed the products they made. Capital was created once people began to change the methods of making those products. Similarly, intellectual capital is not created by changing what we think about. Capital is created by changing our methods of thinking. Until we focus upon natural, yet seemingly unfamiliar ways of learning. Since about the Second World War, a growing number of scientists and philosophers have been articulating theories about systems.
We can understand the world as things, that is parts or components, and their relations, that is how they are connected or fit together.
We begin to invest time into continually changing and improving our methods of thinking. We will be dealing with intellectual tools rather than intellectual capital. For the last 100 years, the productivity of people who make and move things, the folks who use industrial capital, has continually increased. The productivity of knowledge workers, the folks who use intellectual tools, has not kept pace. To change this will require that we focus